Well, this will be the conclusion of our topics. This is section 13, Constitutional Political Economy. And a number of you will either have taken or will take Professor Clark's class, Constitutional Political Economy, and I recommend that to any of you. Today, what we're just going to do is just really have an overview of it within the framework of public choice and some of the things that we've been talking about. It'll primarily just be comments on things that sort of pointed out. But basically what you're looking at is an institutional framework in which you're going to develop the rules of the game. Right, so we're gonna write statutes, which are going to be the rules of the game. Only what framework within which are we going to be writing these statutes? And you remember, for those of you who had Econ 105, what did Hayek say? Right, Hayek said that in the Constitution of Liberty, he says that the temporary majority has to be bound by general principles, and that we're going to limit the power of the temporary majority by these general principles by which we govern ourselves, and that is what the Constitution is about, right? The Constitution is there to limit. Constitution is there to limit the temporary majority. That is, okay, I have the votes. You know, I got the votes in the legislature, I got the votes in the Congress to pass legislation, but should I be able to pass any old legislation that I want? And Hayek's point is, remember that, well, and for those of you who have had 105 and those who haven't had 105, Hayek talks about that the role of government is to limit the total amount of coercion. And, you know, in the absence of government, the strong are prey upon the weak. You know, Hobbes's life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So we're going to have a government to overcome this strong preying upon the weak. But then how do you limit what your government can do? How do you keep it from becoming Leviathan? And so Hayek argues that you have this Constitution, which is a higher order of law. Remember that from, again, those who've had Econ 105. It's a higher order of law, so that ordinary law has to comply with it. Now, one approach to this, how we're going to write up a constitution, would be a contractual approach. That is there a contract that we could get together and say, you know what, this is probably the best way to do it. Think about what you're going to do. You're going to limit the things that you can do in the future, but you think that that limitation on what you can do in the future is actually going to be a benefit to everybody. And so if you sort of think about, Vixel and Buchanan, right? They talked about, okay, remember Vixel talked about unanimity, then we talked about Buchanan having the optimal majority for things. The idea being that we can, there's transactions cost to doing things. If we had to have unanimity, remember we talked about this transactions cost and the externality cost, et cetera. So the idea is that, okay, maybe we could agree on some framework within which we're going to develop the rules of the game in the future, so we're putting a limit on what we can do in the future. Now, there's been suggestion, remember, so we talked about Rawls, right? So should you make the rule behind a veil of ignorance? Now that I think about it, not 100% sure how you spell veil, but I'm thinking that's how you do. But in any event, you're going to make a decision behind a veil of ignorance. That is, you don't know what your position is going to be when you make this decision about, here's what the rules of the game are. You don't know whether you're going to be the dictator or not. So should we make the decision about, when we're making up what the Constitution should be like, should it be like, what Rawls was saying, that we should set the system up so that it benefits those who may be the poorest person there, or the worst off person in the worst off position. But the bottom line is you're going to be bound by rules which are going to constrain. They're going to constrain what your future choices are going to be. And of course, that's what, again, an efficient constitution would be, or let's say a perfect constitution in some sense, would be one where we all agree, right? We all say, okay, we're all better off by doing this. And so, again, if we got to Wicksel's unanimity, okay, and of course, it would be hard to get there, but the idea is, when we go to structure the Constitution, how do we make the Constitution, right? If you think back to the Articles of Confederation, we started out that way in the United States of America, right? And then we eventually became had our Constitution and got rid of the Articles of Confederation and developed the Constitution. So how are we going to put this thing together? Then once you had it, is that once you've got this Constitution that says, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're constraining the temporary majority. We're going to say, you know what, again, democracy is the optimal way of putting or making decisions by the government. If you read Mises's Liberalism or Hayek's Constitution of Liberty, talk about that. But then that democracy's got to be limited. So the question is, once you've set up these rules of the game, how to enforce them? How are you going to enforce these limitations? What did we do in the United States? We have the Supreme Court. And of course, again, those who had 105, I keep coming back to this. But if you look at the Constitution itself, it doesn't provide that the Supreme Court can strike down laws by the legislature. That comes about in the court case Marbury versus Madison. Okay, but what we've agreed to basically in the United States is that the Supreme Court is enforcing these rules of the game. If if the legislature or the Congress passes something, then the court decides, can't do that, right? And in the state of Michigan, for example, the Michigan Supreme Court is the enforcer of the Constitution. Says, no, legislature can't do that. That's unconstitutional. How does this work? Murray Rothbard, if you read his book, Libertarian Manifesto, if you read his book, Murray Rothbard, again, is a striking libertarian, that he's pretty far off on the libertarian end of things. He doesn't think that governments are capable of being limited. And that we ought not have government at all, so that's sort of an extreme point. But in any event, we in the United States have decided that the Supreme Court is the mechanism by which we're going to set that limit, going to enforce these rules of the game that says here's what the legislature can and can't do. Or it could be that we just recognize that there's a Nash equilibrium and we agree to do it, right, without any enforcement. Right? Remember the Nash equilibrium when we were talking about game theory, right? You're doing the best thing given what everybody else is doing, and they're doing the best thing given what you're doing. And an example, of course, would be walking on the right side of the street. Now, a Nash equilibrium is also driving on the right side of the street or or driving on the left side of the street, but we actually have laws, right, that says, no, everybody's going to drive on one side of the street or the other, depending upon you're, in Australia or in the United States, you can pick one way or the other. But if you think about it, when you're walking down the street, there's no law that says, you're walking, let's say on the sidewalk or wherever, you're walking down some sidewalk in New York, which is now empty, but, that's, forget about the coronavirus. In a regular time, you'd be walking down the street, and if you're coming and someone else is coming towards you, what do? You move to the right, okay? And why is that? It's because we drive on that side of the road. We've talked about that before. But it may be that there's that the gains from whatever rules that we have are sufficient that people will recognize this, and you won't need a power of the state somehow to enforce what the rules of the game. All right. So let's just make some comments here. The first comment, these are just sort of general comments that we'll make. The first comment is, once they got the state set up, there's an incentive to rent seek. Right? We talked about rent seeking, right? In some detail. So once you've set up the governmental structure, there's going to be an incentive to rent seek. And why is that? You've got concentrated benefits. You've got rationally ignorant people out there. You don't know what the sugar quota is. You don't know what the limitations are on whether you can become a hairdresser or not, or whatever. The average person doesn't. Maybe if you're trying to become a hairdresser, you would. But there's an incentive for individuals to rent seek, and we talked about how inefficient that was, right? That you're going to use up resources so it's a negative sum game, so you use up resources doing that. And so should we have some sort of laws to limit that? Should we attempt to have laws that limit the amount of rent seeking you could have? And if you even have laws that do that, are they going to be efficient? Okay, so we're going to try to set up some constitutional provisions that when we say, okay, here's what the Constitution says, and so it's going to limit the ability of the legislature to engage in what did Bastiat say? Legalize plunder, right? So if you remember that, in 1850 in the law, again, I keep coming back to Econ 105, but we talk about Bastiat's in the law. What did he say? He says that the plundered classes will attempt to engage in the making of the law, right? The plundered classes will attempt to engage in the making of the law. That is, once the government engages in what he called legalized plunder, and legalized plunder was, does it take from one person, and does the law take from one person and give to another, or does the law give, if the purpose of the law is to give one person an advantage over another? If the government does that, he says, hey, guess what? The plundered classes are going to attempt to engage in the making of the law, and he says by violent or other means. He's looking at revolutions that were going on in France in 1843 and 1848, et cetera. But bottom line is, the point is, or the bottom line here is that, are we capable of writing a provision that would reduce the ability of people to rent seek? It may be that it's hard, that Bastiat would say, you know what, really hard to do. The point is then to make it so that your government cannot engage in legalized plunder. That would have to be one of the rules of the game in the Constitution, to say the government can't take from one person and give to another. Because if you don't constrain the legislature through that Constitution, then rent seeking is going to occur. Second thing to deal with is what's called the principal agent problem. And some of you have probably heard about this. And that principal agent problem is that the interests of the agent may not be the same as the principal. That is, in our particular instance here, what we're talking about are the incentive of the legislator may be different than the incentive of the constituents. That is, you as a constituent may want to have, you're interested is in limited government, but I as the legislator, I may want to have lots of power. That's why I ran for office, is so I could get the power to do things, okay? And so it may be that you've got this principal agent problem here. How do you deal with that? How do you set up your constitution so that the incentives of the legislator match up with the incentives of the constituents? And again, this is this problem of rational ignorance, right? That is, if you have rational ignorance, things may be happening, the legislator may be doing things that you are unaware of, and those things are not in your best interest, not the thing that you would like to have. So is there a mechanism that you could constrain the legislative body somehow through your constitution that would fix this principal agent problem within the legislature? And you also have the same situation with the bureaucracy. Right? When we talked about bureaucracy, what was one of the things that we talked about was Niskanin's idea, right? And what was that? Was that the bureaucrat was trying to maximize the budget, right? The bureaucrats would be out there. We had this asymmetric information story that said that the bureaucrat knew more about what it cost to produce a certain level of public services than what the legislative body did. The bureaucrat knew the demand of the legislative body, and the bureaucrat would try to maximize their budget. And even Wagner said that, well, hey, maybe that doesn't make perfect sense, because maybe there's ways that the legislative body could figure out what the cost of production was. And so he suggested that perhaps what's going on is the legislative body and the bureaucracy are both trying to maximize the size of the budget. But nonetheless, the point is that you've got, in this Niskanen model, you have that the interests of the legislators may be different than the interests of the bureaucrat, and is there some sort of mechanism that you could to create proper incentives for that? Another comment would be, do you allow the individual constituencies to make the law? We have the idea of initiated law and referendum, and allowing for constitutional amendment. And the idea then is, can the individual constituencies petition? And put it on the ballot. If you look at this, what's the argument for this? Just sort of think about that. What is the argument that would say, do I need two T's here? I don't know. My spelling, it's not the best. And I think it's partly because you can get lazy, and the spell check thing just corrects it for you automatically. So ballot either has 1 T or 2 T's, but I can't remember. But in any event, how does this work? The way it works is that in 24 states, what can happen is if you collect sufficient signatures, depending on their individual state constitutions, if you collect sufficient signatures, then you can, and usually it's a percentage of the people that voted in the last gubernatorial election. If you collect so many signatures, then it gets approved by a committee at the a committee at the state level, and it says, okay, these are actually registered voters. I can't go up and sort of, make up signatures or whatever. But so it approves it, and it says, okay, you guys, this is going to now go on the ballot. So what you do is you come up with a statute, you come up with a law, you write the law yourself, and then what you do is you get sufficient signatures that law then goes on the ballot, and people are going to vote for the piece of legislation or not directly. So there's a direct election. So rather than the statute having to be run through the legislative system, the individuals can do this. So there are 24 states that allow for initiated law. Now, a referendum is that you can basically overturn or repeal, we'll just say repeal, an existing statute. So that, let's say the legislature passes some law that a bunch of us aren't happy with. What you can do is you can gather signatures that say, we're going to repeal this law. And then if you gather enough signatures, then on the ballot it will say, hey, do you want to repeal this law or not? States also allow for constitutional amendment. That is, if I want to amend the Constitution of the state of Michigan, if I collect enough signatures, then that will show up on the ballot. And there's all rules and the like about whether it shows up at the next general election ballot, etc. Interesting thing to think about this is then what are you going to get? You're going to get rationally ignorant voters right, voting on perhaps some sort of detailed legislation. California is a state that uses initiated law moderately often, and so you might get laws that are in conflict with other laws, and again, do you want to have the rationally ignorant people voting on detailed pieces of legislation, or do you say, hey, there's a problem here in the legislative process, right? That is there's an imperfection in the legislative process, right? Because again, just as we just talked about, maybe the incentives of the legislators are in conflict with what the incentives of the voters are, and so the trick here is that there's a trade, as with everything else, right? There's a trade-off. You've got imperfection in the legislative process. You've got rent seekers out there, maybe the lobbyists for these organizations or corporations or associations or whatever. They're getting legislation passed, and they're knowing that the average voter may not know what's going on. And so maybe a group of citizens go, wow, you know, hey, did you know that this was a bad idea? And they get together and get a referendum to repeal it. Or they say, you know what? The legislature is being constrained by the lobbying, rent-seeking sector. We're gonna have a law that wouldn't have passed through the legislature. There's a number of ways that states deal with this. For example, in Michigan, if you have an initiated law, you gather the signatures. That law doesn't go directly to the ballot. The legislature can adopt it. And if the legislature adopts it, it doesn't go to the ballot. Why would you do that? Well, because in Michigan, you need a supermajority. You need a 3/4 vote in the legislature to amend an initiated law. So if what happened was we were in the legislature and we said, hey, you know what? We think this thing is going to pass if it goes to the ballot. There's a bunch of rational, ignorant folks out there that are going to want to increase the minimum wage to $1,000 an hour. Okay, that's going to cause all sorts of problems. And if we let it go to the ballot, then and it gets passed, then it's going to take a 3/4 vote to amend the thing. Here's what we'll do. We'll take the petition, we will adopt it, and then it's like a regular law. We can come back later on and amend it through the normal process. That is, if we have a majority, we can go ahead and amend it. So there's, again, some interesting structures within the constitutional framework. How might you set that up, right? So as I said, 24 states allow for initiation and referendums and for constitutional amendments. And so how you set that up may affect the outcome. Well, it certainly will affect the outcome. In fact, Michigan recently, that happened with the increase in the minimum wage in the state of Michigan. I don't know if you were rationally ignorant and not paying attention to this, but there was a petition drive to increase the minimum wage in Michigan, and the legislators, even though they thought it might not be a grand idea, it wouldn't have had the votes if you were to try to pass it through the legislature. The legislature adopted it because they were afraid that if it went to the ballot, that it would in fact be approved. And then if they wanted to change that amount on the minimum wage, they would need a 3/4 vote to do it. So they went ahead and adopted it and then amended it to lower what the minimum wage would be. Next comment is exit versus voice. And exit versus voice is what we were talking about with Tibu, right? We said, okay, can I just get up and move away somewhere? Only within the Constitution, think about it in this way. That is secession. That is, should you be able to secede, right? If we went back to prior to the Civil War, should the South be able to secede? If it were clear in the Constitution that the South could secede, then that might have put a constraint on what the North could do. And again, secession came about on two issues: slavery and tariffs. But one of the issues was tariffs, because the North had a majority in the Congress, and what they were doing is imposing tariffs on goods that were being manufactured in the United Kingdom, and in order to do what? In order to make it, the North was a manufacturing center, in order to make it so that the South when they traded their agriculture to the UK, they would not be able to buy as much stuff back because there was now a tariff being imposed on that. So they would then be buying more stuff from the north. So, but the point here being is that if you can secede, then that would put a constraint on the government overall. So the question is, when you put your constitution together, should you allow for secession? We settled that through the Civil War, 1861 to 1865. But some states, or excuse me, some countries do allow for secession. That is Canada, for example, right? Every now and then, it actually comes up with a where the Quebec will sometimes have a get fired up to possibly secede from the Canadian government, and occasionally they'll have a ballot, and it always loses. But nonetheless, the ability to secede may put a constraint on what the legislative body can do. Again, Tibu would have the idea of that individuals could leave and move to another city. Here, you have the idea that a state or a province or a sub-government could actually leave and move somewhere and exit and form their own country. So the Canadian Constitution, as I mentioned, allows for secession. It may be that you might be more willing to, if you are a subgroup, you might be more willing to have to be part of a country if you had a sub-government and you could leave. For example, I might be, if I were in Iraq or someplace like that, and I was, the Kurds, if I could have my own province, and if that province could leave the country, then I might be more willing to join Iraq because I know that my ability to secede would put a constraint on what the other ethnic groups might have, whatever power they might have. But what's the what do you also need? You need a credible commitment to the rules. To what the rule, you need a credible commitment to what the rules of the game are. If you think about this, how does the Constitution work? You need a supermajority. You need a supermajority to amend the Constitution. And again, from Econ 105, Hayek was talking about that what is the Constitution about, right? It's about setting out these general principles by which we're going to govern ourselves and put those into a document which creates a higher order of law. But maybe the general principles change over time. And if they do, then you ought to amend the Constitution to account for the fact that you've changed your general principles. But you don't want a majority to be able to amend the thing, because then how is that acting as a constraint? If the majority can just go ahead and amend the Constitution anytime that it wants to do something, then it won't be effective in constraining the temporary majority. So the idea is that if you're going to amend the Constitution, there has to be a provision that provides for an acknowledgement that there's been a change in the general principles. So, of course, how do you amend the Constitution of the United States? You can do it through an Article 5 convention, on which you need 2/3 of the states to call for the convention, and then it's got to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. Or you can have a 2/3 vote of the Congress to put the constitutional petition out there, and then it has to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. So what is that all about, right? That's all about knowing that, okay, if in fact 3/4 of the state legislators say, hey, yeah, we agree with this, then there's probably been a change in what the general principles about how we're going to govern ourselves are. It's interesting that Buchanan, again, has an interesting idea, and that he says that you could have internal exit. That is, can a portion of a state become a state? That is, it leaves the state government and forms a new state government. So, as an example, might be what if could Southern California, a group of counties, maybe what they could do, just sort of thinking about this theoretically, could a group of counties in Southern California decide we're exiting and we're going to form a new state and we're going to exit from California and we'll become the 51st state? Just sort of an interesting thing to talk about. So again, what are the problems in allowing for exit? A major problem is if you allow for exit, how do I know that we've got a credible commitment? How do we know that we credibly commit a commitment of the states, right, or the sub-governments, states in the United States? And that was this issue of the Articles of Confederation. What was the argument used in the Federalist Papers to talk about why the Articles of Confederation might not work? And the idea was, okay, this was really just a confederation of states, and they said, okay, what if the Spanish attack Florida? How do I know that New York is going to send troops down there to help defend Florida? And so the Articles of Confederation, the problem that was thought about that is that it wasn't going to work. You needed a stronger commitment to dealing with defense issues. So that led to the elimination of the Articles of Confederation. We actually formed one federal government, and so what was the idea here was that Madison talked about, okay, here's what we need to do, and Hayek talks about it in the Constitution of Liberty, is that you need a bicameral legislature. And that the idea here is that might limit what the power of the central government is, that you have a Senate and you have a House and they're elected differently, and so you can and that might be something that you'd want to take a look at. Again, the idea of a bicameral legislature was to minimize the amount of coercion that the federal government could have, because you have the Senate, elected differently than the House. That was what they were thought about, that the Senate was to be elected by the legislators of the states. And so the idea is that in order to coordinate the power that you needed to be coercive, it limited that ability to coordinate that power. And so Madison thought that a bicameral legislature might be one way to limit what the power of the power of this federal government. So this was this idea of also this idea of federalism, right? That is, you have states have certain powers, and the Congress or the federal government has powers. Again, what does the 10th Amendment talk about, right? The 10th Amendment talks about that the powers of the federal government are enumerated in the Constitution, and all the other powers are retained by the states or the people respectively, right? And so the idea here is that you got one unit of government to do some things, and notice that your ability to move about, and we were talking about Exeter versus voice here, your ability to move from Michigan to Ohio or Illinois to Indianapolis, or to Indiana, that ability is greater than your ability to move from the United States to somewhere else, right? To Mexico, or Mexico to the United States, whatever. And so the idea of federalism is that the ability for you to move, you have all sorts of different units of government within the country as a whole, and those units of government are going to be limited in their ability to be coercive because people are going to exit. Same as we were talking about TBU, the idea that efficient cities will outcompete inefficient cities as people move about here. The point here is that the rules of how you set this thing up can affect what the outcomes are, and you can also look at how your preferences for how you want to govern yourself are going to affect what the rules are. Let's close with one issue that's sometimes comes up. Every now and then it comes up more than others, but there's this issue of how did we structure the Electoral College, right? So if we think about the Electoral College, what is that about, right? The Electoral College is a mechanism by which we would elect the president. That's how the Constitution was put together, right? And so let me just read to you something from Madison Federalist 68. And the idea is that you have the informed individuals vote for the president. Now, again, when we're talking about rational ignorance and the fact that a third of the people that were being interviewed were not able to name the the three branches of government. In fact, I can't even remember. Maybe it was a third couldn't even name one branch of government. But anyway, you have the idea that who's voting for the presidency. The idea of the Electoral College is that an informed person is the one that's actually the one voting for the president. You out there are not the ones that are voting for the president. You vote for electors, and those electors then are well informed, and they go and vote for the president. Let me read you from Madison's Federalist 68. It was equally desirable that the immediate election should be made by men most capable of analyzing the qualities adapted to the station and acting under circumstances favorable to deliberation, and to a judicious combination of all the reasons and inducements which were proper to govern their choice. A small number of persons, selected by their fellow citizens from the general mass, will be most likely to possess the information and discernment requisite to such complicated investigations. Okay? So this is Madison Federalist 68. Right? So the idea was that you'd have would have informed people making the decision, just as the same thing as the idea of the Senate was going to be elected by until the 17th Amendment. Till the 17th Amendment, the Senate was elected by the state legislators, who would not be so rationally ignorant, right? They would know who the person was that was going to be in the Senate, and they would know, how they were voting, etc. The idea was, similar here. That is, the Electoral College would get together, and then they would vote for the president, and they would be a well-informed group. But today, how does this really work? Today it works is that the parties nominate the electors. Right? So the Republican Party will have electors that are for whatever the Republican Party candidate is going to be. The Democratic Party has electors. The Libertarian Party, Gary Johnson ran in 2016. So they have their electors, and then what do? You vote for the president. You vote for the presidential candidate of the party. So you go out there and you guys go out and vote for the presidential candidate of the party, and then what happens is the electors are supposed to vote for that candidate. So So really what's going on is you go out and you vote for Hillary Clinton. When you vote for Hillary Clinton, what you're really doing is you're voting for the Democratic Party, and then there's a list of electors, and Hillary Clinton is the candidate for the Democrats. So those electors, when they get to the Electoral College to have the vote, they're supposed to vote for Hillary Clinton. Now, two states, Maine and Nebraska, the way they set it up is the electors are by, two of the electors are by a vote of the state, and the rest of their electors are by congressional district. The other 48 states in the District of Columbia, the way their works is, so other than Maine and Nebraska, it's winner take all, right? And we talked about some of the problems with single vote plurality, right? When we talked about winner take all when we were talking about that. So most states then, or 48 of the states, will vote on a winner take all. Now, there is occasionally what's called a faithless elector. And there's been occasions where there's a faithless elector and there's been a number of them where, let's say you were the Democratic candidate, you were nominated by the Democratic Party, and Hillary Clinton wins your state, and you go to the Electoral College, you're supposed to vote for Hillary Clinton. But sometimes they have not done that. There's been a number of times where there's been faithless electors. It's never, so this happens. And, you can look up faithless elector, under Google that, and you can get all the data on where the faithless electors, where they're from and how often it's happened. But it's never changed the presidential vote. It's never changed the presidential vote. And so there are a number of states. In fact, there are 32 states. 32 states plus the District of Columbia have laws that require that you have faithful elector. That is, you have to vote. There's a law that you have to vote for the candidate of your party when you get there. There's not really good ways to enforce it, but anyway, there has never been where it has affected the presidential candidate. Now, just within this, just commenting on things, there have been 5 times that the winner of the popular vote did not win the election. That is, they lost in the Electoral College. And these were 1824, 1876, 1888, and then more recently in 2000 and 2016, this was when Al Gore won the popular vote and Bush won. And this is one where Hillary Clinton won the popular vote and Donald Trump won. In fact, if you look at the 2016, Trump won the Electoral College 306 to 232. And Hillary won the popular vote. But if you exclude California, where Clinton had a massive victory, Trump won. I believe it was, is it 51.3 to 48.7%. Now, what does this really mean? It really means that how you structure the system will affect how you campaign, right? The system will affect how you campaign. That is, in a winner-take-all system, the presidential campaign is basically 12 states, right? We know about, you've heard about the 12 battleground states, right? Under the current system, in the presidential election, what do you really have? You got these 12 battleground states. So realistically, and I know I'm not writing large enough, trying to get accustomed to a new style. But at any rate, there are 12 battleground states, and we know that, for example, if you're a Republican, you're not going to go to California and campaign. You might try to raise some money there, but you're really not going to hold big meetings, et cetera, and rallies and stuff to get people to vote for you, because it's winner take all. So if you lose California by 100 votes or 1,000 votes or 20,000 votes, then the other, your opponent is going to get all the electors. So realistically, then I'm not going to, if I'm, I only have so much time and I only have so much, resources, I'm not going to go and campaign in states where it's pretty clear who's going to win. And then when we were looking at congressional districts and seeing, how many congressional districts there are where they're competitive, there's really 12 out of the 50 states which tend to be competitive. And the rest, we pretty well know it's not going to be close enough for me to go and spend a lot of money and time there in order to try to win that state, because the issue is that it's winner take all. So that has led to something called the National Popular Vote. And we just want to give you an idea what that's about. Because sometimes you hear comments about the National Popular Vote. Sometimes you hear about it gets rid of the Electoral College or whatever. It doesn't really get rid of the Electoral College. It operates within, it doesn't require a constitutional amendment. If you were to get rid of the Electoral College, what you'd have to have? You'd have to have a constitutional amendment in order to do that. But really what it is an interstate compact. And interstate compacts are allowed under the Constitution. In public finance, we talk about how do you collect sales taxes for a good that's sold in another state. It's been ruled that if you're the state of Michigan, you can't force somebody that that lives in Michigan, you can't force the state of Ohio to collect the sales tax if there's no what's called nexus by the company. So, for example, if you were to buy a book from Amazon, if Amazon doesn't have a warehouse or doesn't have any sort of retail outlet or anything in the state of Michigan, then Amazon doesn't have to collect the sales, and it's called a use tax. Technically, it's called a use tax, but it's basically a use tax is equivalent of a sales tax. When you live in a state and you bring something in, you have to pay a tax which is equivalent to the sales tax to make it so that out-of-state companies don't have an advantage over your in-state companies. But the bottom line is there was a rule that said that Michigan can't force a retailer in the state of Ohio or someplace to collect Michigan's use tax. So what happened was a bunch of states got together and formed an interstate compact to say that we will collect the sales tax or the use tax for goods that are sold to someone. Let's say in Michigan would say, we'll collect a use tax on goods that are sold to Ohio residents, and Ohio agrees to collect the use tax on goods that are bought from a Michigan company. So interstate compacts exist. So the idea then is within this, within the Constitution, is that there's going to be this interstate compact. And the agreement is that, that the states that are in the agreement will say that we will cast our electors for the winner of the national popular vote. That is, whoever wins nationally in the popular vote, they will get all the states that are in this agreement will do this. And what triggers this is when states with 270 electoral votes, that's what you need to win the election. Once the states with 270 electoral votes have signed onto the agreement, then the compact is enforceable. Let me write this over here. The compact is enforceable. Okay, so again, if right now there are 16 states there's 16 states in the compact right now, and they have a total of 196 electoral college votes. So the agreement is not enforceable right now because you don't have enough states to trigger the Interstate Compact. It's close. You know, if you had a couple major states that would come in and add their electoral college votes here to get it to 270, then it would become enforceable. Now, and one of the points here is that it's not that the electoral college is an issue, but rather that it's winner take all. Right? That's the issue. If all the states did it like Maine and Nebraska, then I would know that I could go to a congressional district let's say, if California operated that way, I could go to a congressional district in Maine, or let's say, I was saying California. I could go to an electoral, I could go to a congressional district in California and campaign there, and then maybe I'll pick up that, that electoral college vote. So I would change the way that I would, that you campaign. Again, under winner take all, I'm not going to do that. And what might happen is under the national popular vote, if that compact were to come into enforcement, that is, we got states with 270 votes, then you'd still have the electoral college, okay? But you'd campaign differently because of the whoever wins the popular vote would win the election. Now, there's all sorts of pros and cons on this issue. If you want to, again, if you wanted to do your paper on the national popular vote, you could do that. But the point here is that also you can remove yourself. A state could remove itself from the compact. So let's say there was the number of states that joined the Interstate Compact triggered the 270. There's an election in 2024, and people go, oh my gosh, this was a stupid way to do it. Okay. Then, or let's say the state of California had joined the compact and says, hey, this is a stupid way to do it, we're withdrawing. Then the electoral college is still there, so you'd go back. Once you had less than the 270 electoral college votes, the compact would not be enforceable anymore, and so you'd go back to the way it did. So it's not again, just trying to make clear how this thing would work. Again, there's all sorts of pros and cons on either side. What would you do about a recount if you had, if it was close enough on the national popular vote? Would you have to recount every state? And, again, there's issues on pros and cons on either side. But why does it exist, or why is this interstate compact possibly sitting out there? It's not because electoral college is the problem. It's, again, winner take all. And remember, we were talking about different ways of having elections and what are some of the problems with single vote plurality, et cetera. So it really sort of fits in with that. All right. So basically, to sort of summarize this section, what's going on is that the Constitution is a document that sets out these general principles to limit what the temporary majority is, and so that, and generally the power of the government as a whole. And so again, you might want to take Professor Clark's class on constitutional political economy to go through the detail of these things. But these are just sort of comments on things that say, well, okay, if we're going to, how do we structure the overall rules of the game? how do we structure, here's what you can and can't do within making what the, making what individual pieces of legislation are. We've got this binding, higher order of law on what those general principles are, and how do you construct what that higher order of law looks like. What should be in the Constitution, what doesn't work in a Constitution, different circumstances may, it may be that your particular situation would be that that a secession clause works well for you, but then you might have a different set of circumstances in another country where a secession clause isn't going to work. All right, well, that concludes all the topics that we're dealing with this semester. I hope you were able to, gain something from this. I mean, of course, we feel sorry that we didn't get to interact like we normally do, and again, hope that your family does well, and look forward to seeing those of you who are not graduating. Look forward to seeing you guys next fall.